79 years ago, a 19-year-old farm boy named Klaus wrote his final letter home. He folded it carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked into a battle that would define the next 60 years of his life. What he wrote in that letter would shock you. What he didn't write would haunt him forever. Tonight, you're about to witness something unprecedented, not the war you learned about in history class, not the sanitized version Hollywood feeds you. This is the war as experienced by the men who fought it on the losing side, the German soldiers whose stories have been buried beneath decades of shame, silence, and selective memory. For the first time, we're breaking the ultimate taboo of World War II documentaries. We're asking the question that makes everyone uncomfortable. What was it like to be them? Every war has two sides, but only one gets to tell its story. What happens when the losers finally speak? What happens when the villains of history reveal they were just scared teenagers who missed their mothers and dreamed of home? What happens when you discover that the enemy had faces, names, families and fears exactly like yours? Klaus Brenner kept a secret for 62 years. He carried it through his marriage, through raising his children, through watching his grandchildren grow up. Only on his deathbed did he whisper the truth to his grandson, a truth so devastating that it would shatter everything his family believed about the man they loved. But Klaus wasn't unique. Millions of German soldiers returned home carrying secrets that would poison their families for generations. Secrets about what they saw, secrets about what they did. And most terrifying of all, secrets about what they discovered about themselves when everything they believed in collapsed around them. You think you know this story. You think you understand World War II. But you've only heard half the conversation. Tonight, for the first time, you'll hear the voices that have been silenced for nearly 8 decades. You'll discover that the most dangerous thing about war isn't the bullets. It's how it reveals who you really are when civilization falls away. These aren't the stories of heroes or villains. These are the stories of human beings caught in the machinery of history, making choices that would echo through generations. Some of those choices will surprise you, others will horrify you, all of them will force you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Under the right circumstances, any of us could have been them. The farm boy who wrote that final letter lived to be 87 years old. He became a grandfather, a pillar of his community, a man his neighbours respected and loved. But he never forgot what he had done in the war, and in his final moments he made a choice that would change his family forever. What did Klaus write in that letter? What secret did he carry for 62 years? And why did he choose to reveal it only when he was dying? The answers lie in the untold story of World War II, the story of ordinary men who discovered that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It comes disguised as duty, as loyalty, as the simple act of following orders. It comes disguised as survival. Tonight, you'll journey into the forbidden territory of empathy. You'll see through the eyes of the enemy. You'll walk in the boots of the men history remembers as monsters. And you'll discover that the line between hero and villain isn't drawn in ink. It's drawn in blood, in fear, and in the split-second decisions that define a lifetime. This is not a story about politics or ideology. This is a story about the human heart under pressure. This is a story about what happens when civilization collapses and you're left with nothing but your conscience and your will to survive. Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew about good and evil? Are you ready to discover that the enemy had mothers who loved them, dreams that inspired them, and fears that crippled them? Are you ready to confront the most terrifying truth of all, that there, but for the grace of God, go we, Then join us as we break the silence. Join us as we cross the line into forbidden territory. Join us as we discover that the most important stories are the ones we're afraid to tell. This is A Day in the Life, German Soldiers of World War II. The story you've never heard, the perspective you've never seen, the truth that will change everything you thought you knew about war, about humanity, and about yourself. Chapter 1. Before the Sun Rises. The year is 1943. Somewhere in occupied Europe, a metal alarm clock shatters the pre-dawn silence with its harsh mechanical cry. In that jarring moment between sleep and consciousness, 18-year-old Friedrich Weber opens his eyes to another day that might be his last. But Friedrich doesn't know this yet. None of them do. What you're about to witness isn't the sanitized version of war you've seen in Hollywood films. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of what it meant to be an ordinary German soldier during World War II. These aren't the stories of generals plotting grand strategies or political leaders making speeches. These are the voices of farm boys and shopkeepers, students and factory workers who found themselves caught in the machinery of the largest conflict in human history. The alarm clock that woke Friedrich belonged to his squad leader, Sergeant Müller, who had carried it through 3 years of war across 4 different countries. That clock had witnessed more battles than most soldiers would survive. It had ticked through nights of terror in Russian bunkers, marked time during the scorching heat of North African campaigns, and counted down the minutes before countless attacks that claimed the lives of men who had heard its call just hours before. But on this particular morning, as Friedrich struggles to consciousness in a makeshift barracks somewhere between the front lines and oblivion, that clock represents something more profound than just the start of another day. It represents the delicate thread that connects these soldiers to their humanity, to the rhythms of normal life that war threatens to destroy completely. Friedrich Weber wasn't supposed to be here. 6 months ago, he was studying literature at the University of Munich, dreaming of becoming a teacher like his father. His hands, now calloused from handling weapons and digging foxholes, once turned the pages of Goethe and Schiller with the gentle care of someone who believed words could change the world. The irony wasn't lost on him that those same hands now gripped a rifle designed to end lives rather than enlighten minds. The transformation from civilian to soldier didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen willingly for most of these young men. Understanding this process is crucial to grasping the psychological complexity of what we're about to explore. The German military machine didn't just recruit bodies, it systematically broke down individual identity and rebuilt it according to military necessity. When Friedrich first received his conscription notice, delivered by a stern-faced official to his family's modest apartment, his mother wept openly while his father stood silent, remembering his own service in the previous war. The notice was printed on official Reich stationery, adorned with eagles and symbols that meant nothing to a young man whose greatest concern had been passing his philosophy examinations. The transformation began immediately. Basic training lasted 12 weeks, but the psychological conditioning took much longer. Friedrich learned to march in perfect formation, to disassemble and reassemble his weapon blindfolded, to follow orders without question. But more significantly, he learned to suppress the part of himself that questioned whether what he was doing was right. The military understood that doubt was more dangerous than enemy bullets, because doubt could spread through an entire unit like a contagious disease. The letters Friedrich wrote home during this period reveal a young man struggling to maintain his sense of self while adapting to military life. In one letter to his sister Anna, he wrote, "They tell us we are defending the fatherland, but I wonder sometimes what we are really defending. Is it our homes and families, or is it something else entirely? I try not to think about such things too much, because thinking too much can make a soldier useless." This internal conflict wasn't unique to Friedrich. Across Germany, hundreds of thousands of young men faced the same psychological transformation. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, expected to become instruments of war while somehow retaining enough humanity to function as human beings. The tension between these two requirements would define their entire wartime experience. The human mind craves routine, especially under extreme stress. This psychological principle became a lifeline for soldiers like Friedrich, who clung to small rituals and familiar patterns as anchors in an increasingly chaotic world. Understanding these morning rituals reveals something profound about how human beings adapt to circumstances that should, by all logic, be completely unmanageable. Friedrich's morning routine began the same way every day. Regardless of whether he was in a comfortable barracks or a muddy foxhole, he would sit up slowly, taking inventory of his body to make sure everything still worked. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical necessity. In war, your body is your most important piece of equipment, and a soldier who doesn't understand his physical condition is a soldier who won't survive long. Next came the ritual of shaving, which might seem trivial until you understand its deeper significance. Even when water was scarce, even when the enemy was close enough to hear, Friedrich and his comrades would find ways to shave. They would heat water over small fires, use polished metal as mirrors, and carefully scrape away stubble with razors that often served double duty as utility knives. This wasn't about military regulations, though those existed. This was about maintaining a connection to the civilized world they had left behind. The psychology behind this ritual runs deeper than mere hygiene. When everything else in a soldier's life was controlled by military hierarchy and the chaos of war, the simple act of shaving became a moment of personal autonomy. For 2 or 3 minutes each morning, Friedrich could focus on something ordinary and peaceful. His reflection in that makeshift mirror reminded him that underneath the uniform and the training, he was still the same person who had once worried about term papers and wondered what his future might hold. Reading letters from home formed another crucial part of these morning rituals. Friedrich carried his letters in a waterproof pouch close to his heart, and he had read each one so many times that he could recite them from memory. His mother wrote about the garden she was tending, the neighbours who asked about him, the small dramas of civilian life that seemed impossibly distant from his current reality. His sister Anna sent him pressed flowers and snippets of poetry that she copied from books in the local library. These letters served a psychological function that goes far beyond simple communication. They were tangible proof that another world existed, a world where people worried about mundane things like weather and grocery shopping rather than survival and death. When Friedrich read about his mother's concerns over the tomato plants in her garden, he could momentarily escape the weight of his rifle and the constant awareness that enemy soldiers might be watching him through their scopes. The sharing of photographs represented another vital morning ritual. Friedrich's unit had developed an informal tradition of passing around family photographs while they ate whatever breakfast was available. Each soldier would spend a few moments looking at images of other men's wives, children, parents, and sweethearts, creating a temporary community of shared longing and memory. This photograph ritual served multiple psychological purposes. It reminded the soldiers that they weren't just instruments of war, but human beings with connections to other human beings. It created bonds between soldiers who might have nothing else in common except their shared situation. Most importantly, it provided motivation that went beyond abstract concepts like patriotism or duty. These photographs represented concrete reasons to survive another day. Military training emphasizes unit cohesion and loyalty, but the bonds that actually kept soldiers alive went far deeper than anything taught in basic training. Friedrich and his comrades developed relationships that transcended normal friendship and approached something closer to family loyalty. Understanding this phenomenon is essential to grasping how ordinary individuals functioned in extraordinary circumstances. The brotherhood that developed among soldiers wasn't based on shared ideology or even shared nationality. Friedrich's unit included men from across the German-speaking world, a farmer's son from Bavaria, a mechanic from Vienna, a former bank clerk from Hamburg, and a young man from the Sudetenland who spoke German with a Czech accent. Under normal circumstances, these men might never have met, let alone become deeply connected to each other's welfare. War stripped away the social barriers that would have separated these men in civilian life. Education, social class, regional differences, and personal background became irrelevant when everyone faced the same dangers and depended on each other for survival. Friedrich, the university student, found himself learning practical skills from Hans, the farmer's son, who knew how to find clean water and identify edible plants. In return, Friedrich helped Hans write letters to his girlfriend, translating Hans's simple but heartfelt thoughts into more elegant prose. The psychology of this brotherhood operates on several levels simultaneously. On the most basic level, it's a survival mechanism. Soldiers who look out for each other are more likely to survive than soldiers who operate as individuals. But it goes deeper than mere practicality. These relationships provided emotional sustenance in an environment designed to strip away everything that makes life worth living. Friedrich's diary entries from this period reveal the intensity of these relationships. He wrote about Werner, the former bank clerk, who had developed a nervous habit of counting everything around him. Bullets, rations, days since their last shower, hours since their last decent meal. This compulsive counting might have seemed like a sign of mental breakdown, but Friedrich recognized it as Werner's way of maintaining some sense of control and order in a chaotic environment. The group developed its own language, full of inside jokes and references that only they understood. They had nicknames for everything, their weapons, their officers, the enemy positions they faced, even the rats that shared their quarters. This private language created a psychological boundary between their small group and the larger war machine they were part of. Within this boundary they could maintain some sense of individual identity and personal choice. Trust became the currency of survival. Friedrich learned to sleep deeply when Werner was on watch because he knew Werner would die before allowing harm to come to his sleeping comrades. Werner in turn trusted Friedrich to share food equally even when rations were scarce, and to make smart decisions when Werner's counting compulsions made it difficult for him to think clearly about tactical situations. These bonds were tested constantly. When Hans was wounded during a reconnaissance mission, Friedrich and Werner risked their own lives to bring him back to safety, not because military regulations required it, but because the thought of leaving Hans behind was psychologically unacceptable. The official military doctrine said that the mission came first, but the unofficial code of the Brotherhood said that no one gets left behind. The strength of these relationships created its own psychological burden. Friedrich knew that his survival depended not just on his own skills and luck, but on the continued survival of his comrades. Every morning when he woke up, he had to confirm that everyone in his small circle was still alive and functional. Every evening, he had to process the accumulated stress of a day spent worrying not just about his own survival, but about the survival of men who had become closer to him than his own brothers. This morning ritual of checking on his comrades, of sharing the small gestures of care and concern that kept them all functioning as human beings rather than just as military units, would determine whether Friedrich and his brotherhood could face another day in a war that seemed designed to destroy everything they had ever cared about. The distant rumble of artillery that ended this chapter wasn't just the sound of approaching battle, it was the sound of everything they had built together, their routines, their relationships, their carefully maintained sense of humanity being put to the ultimate test. As Friedrich looked at the faces of his comrades and saw his own fear reflected in their eyes, he realized that whatever was coming would either strengthen their brotherhood beyond anything they had previously experienced, or it would destroy them all. Chapter 2. The Hierarchy of Fear. Every morning in the German Wehrmacht began with a paradox that would haunt millions of young men. They were told they were the master race, the chosen warriors of the Third Reich, destined for glorious victory. Yet when they opened their eyes each dawn, the first emotion they felt wasn't pride or confidence, it was fear. But here's what's truly disturbing about this fear. It wasn't just fear of the enemy, it was fear of their own system, their own commanders, their own shadow that followed them everywhere they went. The German military machine had created something unprecedented in human history. A hierarchy where terror flowed both upward and downward, where every man lived in constant anxiety about the person above him and the person below him. You see, when we think about World War II, we often imagine clear lines of authority, soldiers following orders without question, a well-oiled machine of military efficiency. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more human. The German army was a collection of frightened young men, trapped in a system that demanded absolute obedience while providing no guarantee of survival. The German military hierarchy wasn't just about rank and authority. It was about survival mathematics. Every soldier understood this equation instinctively. The higher your rank, the further you were from the front lines, and the better your chances of seeing home again. But this equation created a psychological prison that affected every decision, every relationship, every moment of every day. Consider the position of a typical German private in 1943. Above him stood his squad leader, a Gefreiter who had survived perhaps 6 months longer than him. Above the Gefreiter stood the Unteroffizier, the sergeant who had somehow managed to survive a year or more. Each level up represented not just authority, but accumulated trauma, accumulated guilt, and accumulated desperation to stay alive. The orders that came down this chain weren't just military commands, they were survival instructions wrapped in the language of duty and honour. When a colonel ordered an attack on a heavily fortified position, he wasn't just moving pieces on a strategic chessboard. He was asking dozens of young men to die so that he could report to his general that he had followed orders. The general, in turn, was asking hundreds to die so he could report to his field marshal. And so the chain continued, all the way up to men who had never seen a battlefield, never smelled gunpowder, never held a dying soldier in their arms. But here's where the psychology becomes truly twisted. Everyone in this chain knew exactly what was happening. The private knew his sergeant was sending him to die to save his own career. The sergeant knew his lieutenant was sacrificing the squad to avoid a court-martial. The lieutenant knew his captain was using the company as expendable pawns in a larger game. And yet, the system continued to function because each man was more afraid of rebellion than death. This created what psychologists now recognize as learned helplessness on a massive scale. Soldiers stopped making decisions based on rational analysis of survival odds. Instead, they made decisions based on fear of immediate punishment from their superiors. A German soldier in 1944 was more likely to charge into machine gun fire than to question an order, not because he was brave, but because he was terrified of what would happen if he hesitated. The non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals, occupied the most psychologically brutal position in the entire German military hierarchy. They were close enough to the front lines to understand the true cost of every order, yet high enough in rank to be held responsible for carrying out those orders. They lived in a constant state of moral vertigo, knowing that their decisions would determine who lived and who died among the men they had grown to care about. Sergeant Klaus Weber from the 116th Panzer Division wrote to his wife in October 1944, "I am no longer a man, Liesel. I am a machine that feeds young boys into the mouth of hell. Every morning I wake up and count my remaining soldiers. Every evening I write letters to mothers I will never meet, explaining why their sons will never come home. I have become death itself, and I do not know how to stop." The psychological pressure on these men was unimaginable. They were expected to maintain discipline and morale among soldiers who increasingly understood they were being used as cannon fodder. They had to enforce orders they knew were militarily suicidal. They had to project confidence in victory while watching their army disintegrate around them. But the most cruel aspect of their position was that they genuinely cared about their men. These weren't heartless automatons following orders without feeling. They were older brothers, father figures, mentors who had formed deep emotional bonds with the young soldiers under their command. When they sent 18-year-old Hans to scout an enemy position, they weren't just risking a military asset. They were potentially sacrificing someone they had taught to shave, someone whose girlfriend's letters they helped him read, someone who reminded them of their own younger brother back home. This emotional investment created a psychological trap that was impossible to escape. The more they cared about their men, the more desperate they became to keep them alive. But the more desperate they became, the more likely they were to make decisions that would ultimately get more of them killed. They would volunteer their squads for dangerous missions to prove their loyalty to higher command, hoping to earn better positions or equipment. They would push their men harder in training, believing that superior preparation would compensate for inferior orders. They would share their own rations with weaker soldiers, slowly starving themselves to death. The Wehrmacht's own psychological studies, conducted secretly during the war, revealed that non-commissioned officers had the highest rates of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffered more nightmares, more anxiety attacks, more episodes of what they called battle fatigue than either the common soldiers or the commissioned officers. They were caught between two impossible loyalties, loyalty to their men and loyalty to their system. Every decision they made betrayed one of these loyalties, and the psychological cost was devastating. The German soldiers' relationship with Nazi ideology was far more complex than most people realize. The vast majority of Wehrmacht soldiers were not fanatical Nazis when they first put on their uniforms. They were ordinary young men who had been subjected to years of propaganda, but whose primary motivations were much more basic. They wanted to serve their country, protect their families, and survive the war with honour. But ideology in wartime isn't just about belief. It's about psychological survival. When reality becomes unbearable, the human mind desperately searches for meaning, for purpose, for some framework that makes sense of senseless suffering. Nazi ideology provided that framework, at least initially. It offered simple explanations for complex situations, clear enemies to blame for every setback, and the promise that all suffering was part of a greater purpose. The problem was that reality has a way of destroying even the most carefully constructed ideological frameworks. When German soldiers were told they were liberating Europe from Bolshevism and then found themselves burning Ukrainian villages, the ideology began to crack. When they were told they were defending Western civilization and then found themselves retreating across the same ground they had conquered years earlier, the ideology began to crumble. But here's what's crucial to understand. The collapse of ideological belief didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen uniformly. It was a gradual, painful process that affected different soldiers in different ways at different times. Some soldiers abandoned Nazi ideology as early as 1941, when they witnessed the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Others held on to it until the very end, using it as a psychological shield against the growing certainty of defeat. The most psychologically damaging aspect of this ideological collapse was that it left soldiers without any framework for understanding their sacrifice. If they weren't fighting for the future of the German race, if they weren't defending their homeland from subhuman enemies, if they weren't part of a glorious historical mission, then what were they dying for? What meaning could be found in the death of their friends, the destruction of their cities, the suffering of their families? Private Friedrich Kellner, writing in his secret diary in 1943, captured this existential crisis perfectly. We were told we were heroes, but we feel like murderers. We were told we were saving Germany, but we are destroying it. We were told we were fighting for the future, but we are burying the past. What are we? What have we become? And how do we live with what we have done? This ideological confusion created a psychological phenomenon that military historians call moral injury, the deep psychological wound that occurs when someone is forced to act against their fundamental moral beliefs. Unlike physical wounds, moral injuries often became more painful over time, festering in the soldier's psyche long after the war ended. By 1943, a dangerous undercurrent of doubt had begun to spread through the German army like a contagious disease. Soldiers who had never questioned authority began to whisper forbidden questions to their closest friends. These weren't political discussions or organized dissent. They were the desperate attempts of traumatized men to make sense of their increasingly senseless situation. The questions started small and seemingly innocent. Why were they retreating if they were winning? Why were their rations getting smaller if the homeland was prosperous? Why were they being asked to hold impossible positions if their commanders were military geniuses? But small questions have a way of growing into larger ones, and larger questions have a way of undermining entire belief systems. The most dangerous question of all was also the most human. What if we're wrong? What if the war wasn't just? What if their cause wasn't righteous? What if they were the aggressors, not the defenders? What if everything they had been told was a lie and everything they had done was for nothing? These questions were literally dangerous to ask. The German military had an extensive network of informants and political officers whose job was to identify and eliminate defeatist thinking. Soldiers who asked too many questions, who expressed too much doubt, who seemed insufficiently committed to the Nazi cause, could find themselves facing a military tribunal, or worse, transferred to a punishment battalion where death was almost certain. But the human mind cannot be completely controlled, especially when it is subjected to extreme stress and trauma. The questions continued to spread, whispered in foxholes during artillery bombardments, scrawled in the margins of letters home, discussed in the coded language of men who had learned to communicate without words. What made these questions particularly psychologically damaging was that they had no safe answers. If a soldier concluded that the war was unjust, what could he do? Desert and abandon his friends? Refuse orders and face execution? Continue fighting for a cause he no longer believed in? Every option led to moral compromise, psychological damage, or physical death. The Wehrmacht's own intelligence reports from 1944 reveal the extent of this psychological crisis. Morale officers reported that soldiers were increasingly asking questions like, "Why are we still fighting if the war is lost? What will happen to our families if we surrender? Are we criminals for following orders? Will God forgive us for what we have done?" These questions represent one of the most profound psychological crises in military history. An entire generation of young men was simultaneously questioning their most fundamental beliefs about duty, honor, country, and morality. They were trapped in a system that demanded absolute certainty while providing increasingly uncertain leadership, fighting a war that made less sense with each passing day. As 1944 progressed and Germany's military situation became increasingly desperate, the psychological pressure on German soldiers reached a breaking point. The hierarchy of fear that had held the army together for years began to collapse under the weight of accumulated trauma, ideological confusion, and the growing certainty of defeat. The signs of this psychological collapse were everywhere, though they were carefully hidden from official reports. Soldiers began to suffer from what they called battle fatigue at unprecedented rates. They experienced nightmares, anxiety attacks, and episodes of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some soldiers simply stopped functioning, sitting in their foxholes, staring into space, unable to respond to orders or threats. But perhaps the most telling sign of the psychological crisis was the increase in what military psychologists call moral injuries. The deep psychological wounds that occur when someone is forced to act against their fundamental moral beliefs. German soldiers were increasingly being asked to do things that violated their basic sense of right and wrong, and the psychological cost was becoming impossible to bear. The final element that pushed many soldiers over the psychological edge was the growing realization that their sacrifice was meaningless. They weren't dying for victory. They were dying to delay defeat. They weren't protecting their homeland. They were prolonging its suffering. They weren't serving a noble cause. They were serving a system that had lied to them from the beginning. This realization created what psychologists call existential despair, the profound psychological crisis that occurs when someone loses all sense of meaning and purpose in their life. German soldiers in the final year of the war weren't just fighting a losing battle. They were fighting a battle that had no meaning, no purpose, no justification beyond the fear of what would happen if they stopped. The hierarchy of fear that had defined the German military experience was finally revealed for what it truly was: a system that had transformed ordinary young men into victims of their own obedience, casualties of their own loyalty, prisoners of their own duty. The very qualities that had made them good soldiers, discipline, loyalty, courage, had become the instruments of their own psychological destruction. As the war entered its final phase, German soldiers faced a terrible choice: continue fighting for a cause they no longer believed in, or risk everything to find a way out of the psychological prison they had helped to build. For most, there was no real choice at all. They were trapped in a system that had taught them to fear their own thoughts more than enemy bullets, their own doubts more than certain death. The hierarchy of fear had consumed an entire generation, and there was no escape, except through the complete collapse of everything they had once believed in. The morning that began with paradox would end with tragedy, and the young men who had started the war as believers would finish it as broken survivors of their own shattered faith. Chapter 3. The Geography of War. The human body can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. But what happens when you're asked to fight a war while your body is slowly dying from conditions that would kill most people in peacetime? German soldiers discovered that the Third Reich's ambitions stretched across climates so extreme that the weather itself became a deadlier enemy than any opposing army. When Adolf Hitler declared war on multiple fronts, he created something unprecedented in human history: a military force scattered across nearly every climate zone on Earth. While you're comfortable in your controlled environment, imagine waking up not knowing if you'll spend your day shivering in -40-degree Russian winters or sweating through North African heat that could literally cook an egg on a tank's metal surface. The psychological impact of this geographical spread cannot be overstated. A young man from Bavaria who had never seen snow deeper than his ankles suddenly found himself in Stalingrad, where the wind chill could freeze exposed skin in minutes. His childhood friend might simultaneously be fighting in Greece, dealing with malaria carrying mosquitoes and temperatures that made metal too hot to touch with bare hands. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was a systematic breakdown of everything these soldiers thought they knew about survival. The human mind relies on familiar patterns and predictable environments to function effectively. When you remove those anchors, when you force someone to operate in conditions their body and mind aren't equipped for, you create a form of psychological warfare that happens before the first shot is fired. The Wehrmacht found itself fighting in Norwegian fjords, where the sun didn't rise for months, creating a depression so severe that suicide rates skyrocketed among troops. Simultaneously, other units were deployed to North Africa, where the absence of familiar seasonal changes created a different kind of mental breakdown. The human circadian rhythm, evolved over millions of years, simply couldn't adapt to these extreme variations fast enough. The temperature in the Russian winter of 1941 dropped so low that German weapons literally froze solid. But here's what most people don't understand about extreme cold. It doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it rewrites the basic rules of survival that your brain depends on to make life or death decisions. When your core body temperature drops just 2 degrees, your fine motor skills disappear. You can't pull a trigger accurately, you can't write a letter home, you can't even button your coat properly. Drop another 2 degrees, and your brain stops processing information normally. Strategic thinking, the ability to assess threats, even basic communication skills, begin to fail. The German soldiers didn't just face enemy bullets in Russia, they faced the systematic shutdown of their own cognitive abilities. But cold wasn't the only climate enemy. In North Africa, German Afrika Korps soldiers discovered that extreme heat creates equally devastating physiological changes. When your body temperature rises above normal, your blood literally thickens. Your heart works harder to pump this thicker blood, which means less oxygen reaches your brain. Decision-making becomes impaired, reaction times slow, and hallucinations can begin. The desert heat also created a cruel psychological torture. These soldiers, many from cool green German countryside, found themselves in a landscape so alien it challenged their basic understanding of what Earth should look like. The constant sun, the endless sand, the complete absence of familiar vegetation. It was like being deployed to another planet, while expected to maintain the same level of military effectiveness. In tropical climates, German soldiers faced a different biological warfare. Diseases they had no immunity to began attacking their bodies. Malaria didn't just make soldiers sick, it created a cycle of fever and chills that made consistent military performance impossible. Dysentery weakened soldiers so severely that basic marching became a Herculean effort. These weren't temporary inconveniences. They were systematic biological attacks that reduced fighting effectiveness more than enemy action. The psychological component of climate warfare goes deeper than physical discomfort. When your environment constantly threatens your survival, your brain shifts into a permanent state of hypervigilance. This creates chronic stress that exhausts mental resources needed for tactical thinking, camaraderie, and emotional resilience. The German soldiers weren't just fighting enemies, they were fighting their own bodies' desperate attempts to survive in environments that challenged every evolutionary adaptation their species had developed. The mathematics of war become terrifyingly simple when you understand logistics. A single German soldier required approximately 4 pounds of food, 2 quarts of water, and various ammunition and medical supplies every day. Multiply that by millions of soldiers spread across thousands of miles, and you begin to understand why the Wehrmacht's supply system became a catastrophe that determined the war's outcome more than any battle strategy. But here's the psychological element that most military historians miss. When supply lines fail, soldiers don't just become hungry and under-equipped. They lose faith in the system they're risking their lives to defend. Every empty supply truck, every delayed food delivery, every request for ammunition that goes unfulfilled sends a message that the leadership either can't or won't take care of the people doing the actual fighting. German soldiers began adapting to supply failures in ways that revealed both human ingenuity and desperation. They learned to identify which types of grass were edible, how to craft makeshift boots from tire rubber, and how to create bandages from newspaper and tree bark. These weren't survival skills taught in training. They were desperate innovations born from abandonment by their own supply system. The psychological impact of these adaptations was profound. When you're forced to scavenge for basic survival needs, you're no longer a professional soldier following military doctrine. You become something more primitive, a person fighting for basic survival who happens to be wearing a uniform. This transformation changed how these soldiers viewed their mission, their leadership, and their chances of survival. Letters from German soldiers reveal a progression from confidence to confusion to bitter resignation as supply failures became routine. Early in the war, soldiers complained about poor food quality. By 1943, they were describing eating soup made from grass and water, grateful for anything that might provide a few calories. By 1944, some units were essentially foraging like medieval armies, taking whatever they could find from civilian populations. The supply crisis also created moral dilemmas that further destroyed unit cohesion. When medical supplies ran out, who received the last bandages? When food became scarce, did officers eat better than enlisted men? When ammunition was limited, which battles were worth fighting? These decisions, made daily by soldiers who never expected to face them, created internal conflicts that weakened fighting effectiveness more than enemy action. The most psychologically devastating aspect of supply failure was the way it revealed the disposability of individual soldiers. When headquarters continued issuing orders for offensive operations while failing to provide basic necessities, soldiers understood that their lives were considered expendable resources. This realization didn't inspire heroic sacrifice. It created cynicism, depression, and a survival mentality that prioritized personal preservation over military objectives. Among the most haunting artifacts of World War II are the thousands of letters found on deceased German soldiers. Letters they wrote, but never had the opportunity to send home. These documents provide an unfiltered view into the psychological state of men who knew they might die before their families could read their final thoughts. The psychology of writing a letter you might never send creates a unique form of emotional expression. Unlike letters intended for immediate delivery, these final communications reveal thoughts soldiers might normally have censored to protect their families from worry. They contain admissions of fear, expressions of doubt, and confessions of experiences that would have been impossible to share in normal correspondence. One pattern emerges repeatedly in these unsent letters: the soldiers' growing awareness that the official narrative they had been told about the war didn't match their lived experience. They wrote about enemies who seemed more human than the propaganda had suggested, about military strategies that made no tactical sense, about orders that seemed designed to waste lives rather than achieve victory. These letters also reveal the evolution of soldiers' priorities as the war progressed. Early letters focused on military achievements and patriotic sentiments. Later letters became increasingly personal, focusing on memories of home, regret for lost opportunities, and desperate wishes to see family members one more time. The transformation from soldier to human being is documented in their own words. The most psychologically revealing aspect of these letters is how they show soldiers preparing for death. They contain instructions for family members, apologies for perceived failures, and attempts to find meaning in experiences that often seemed meaningless. The writers were essentially conducting their own psychological therapy, trying to process trauma and find peace with their situation. Reading these letters today provides insight into the universal human experience of facing mortality under extreme circumstances. The specific details of World War II fade away, replaced by timeless human concerns about love, family, purpose, and the desire to be remembered. These German soldiers, despite fighting for a cause we now recognize as morally bankrupt, were experiencing the same fundamental human emotions that anyone facing death would experience. The fact that these letters were never sent adds another layer of psychological complexity. The soldiers who wrote them died with their final thoughts unexpressed, their last wishes uncommunicated, their final apologies undelivered. This creates a profound sadness that transcends political and historical judgments, reminding us that individual human suffering deserves recognition regardless of the larger context in which it occurred. The radio crackles with static. Then a voice cuts through the interference with news that will change everything. Enemy forces have broken through the defensive line. Supply routes are cut. Reinforcements are not coming. The soldiers who survived the geography of war, who adapted to impossible climates and learned to fight while starving, now face the ultimate test: Actual combat where all their suffering and adaptation will be tested in minutes of life or death action. The war has found them, and there is nowhere left to retreat. Chapter 4. The Hour of Lead. There's a moment that exists between peace and chaos, between the man you were and the man you're about to become. For the German soldier of World War II, this moment lasted exactly as long as it took for the first shot to be fired. What happened next would either save his life or end it, and the difference often came down to a heartbeat, a reflex, a choice made before his conscious mind could catch up. The human brain, when faced with mortal danger, doesn't behave the way we imagine it does. It doesn't slow down time for heroic contemplation or provide crystal-clear thinking under pressure. Instead, it floods the body with chemicals that can make a man superhuman or paralyze him completely. For 18-year-old Hans Weber, crouched in a foxhole outside Stalingrad in October 1942, this neurochemical lottery was about to determine whether he would see his 19th birthday. The transformation begins long before the shooting starts. Military psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades, and what they've discovered challenges everything we think we know about courage and cowardice. The German soldiers waiting for battle weren't thinking about the fatherland or military glory. They were thinking about their bladders. The pre-combat ritual was always the same, according to Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, who survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. First came the nervous urination, sometimes every few minutes, as the body prepared for fight or flight by emptying anything unnecessary for survival. Then came the involuntary muscle tremors, starting in the hands and spreading through the arms and legs. These weren't signs of weakness. They were evolutionary adaptations that had kept humans alive for millennia. But here's what the training manuals never mentioned. The waiting was often worse than the fighting itself. Private Ernst Kellner described it in a letter to his sister as sitting in your own grave, wondering if someone else is going to fill it. The anticipation created a psychological pressure cooker where imagination became the enemy. Every sound could be incoming artillery. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every minute that passed brought them closer to a moment they couldn't predict or control. The German military understood this psychological warfare against their own minds, which is why they employed what psychologists now recognize as distraction techniques. Soldiers were encouraged to check and recheck their equipment, not because it needed constant maintenance, but because repetitive actions helped calm the nervous system. Loading and unloading magazines became a meditation. Adjusting helmet straps became a prayer. Heinrich Müller, a machine gunner from Bavaria, developed his own pre-battle routine that perfectly illustrates how the mind seeks control in uncontrollable situations. He would mentally walk through his childhood home, room by room, remembering the texture of the kitchen table, the colour of his mother's favourite dress, the way sunlight fell across the parlour floor on Sunday mornings. This wasn't nostalgia, it was survival psychology. By anchoring his consciousness to peaceful memories, he created a mental fortress that couldn't be destroyed by artillery. When battle erupted, it didn't announce itself politely. Combat was a full-scale assault on every human sense simultaneously, and the German soldiers who survived learned to navigate this sensory chaos through adaptations that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. The sound hit first and hardest. Not the clean crack of rifles you hear in movies, but a layered symphony of destruction that could permanently damage hearing within minutes. Artillery shells didn't just explode, they tore the air itself apart, creating pressure waves that could rupture blood vessels and disorient the inner ear. Machine gun fire created a sustained ripping sound that soldiers compared to tearing canvas, but canvas that could tear a man in half. But the human ear, remarkably, learned to distinguish between different types of death approaching from different directions. Veteran soldiers could identify the caliber of incoming shells by their whistle, could tell the difference between friendly and enemy machine gun fire by their rate of fire, could even predict where mortar rounds would land by listening to their trajectory. This wasn't conscious learning. It was the brain's desperate attempt to create order from chaos. Corporal Friedrich Weber described the visual assault as watching the world have a nervous breakdown. Explosions didn't just create light, they created visual confusion that could leave a man shooting at shadows or missing enemies standing in plain sight. Smoke and dust didn't just obscure vision, they created a grey world where distance became impossible to judge and familiar landmarks disappeared completely. The smell of battle was something no training could prepare them for. Cordite from explosives mixed with the metallic scent of blood, the acrid smoke of burning equipment, and underneath it all, the unmistakable smell of human fear, sweat laden with adrenaline and terror. Many veterans reported that decades after the war they could still identify these scents immediately, and that encountering them would trigger instant flashbacks to combat. Touch became both more and less important during battle. The body's pain receptors would shut down under extreme stress, allowing wounded soldiers to continue fighting without realizing they had been hit. But at the same time, tactical awareness through touch became crucial for survival. Feeling the vibration of approaching tanks through the ground, sensing the heat signature of recently fired weapons, even reading the emotional state of fellow soldiers through subtle physical cues could mean the difference between life and death. In combat, moral philosophy becomes a luxury that can get you killed. The German soldiers found themselves making life and death decisions in fractions of seconds, with incomplete information, under conditions that would break most civilian minds. These weren't the clear-cut scenarios discussed in ethics classes. They were messy, complicated, human moments where there were no good choices, only immediate consequences. Consider the situation faced by Lieutenant Otto Schneider during the Battle of Kursk. His squad had captured a strategic building when they discovered it was being used as a field hospital, treating both German and Soviet wounded. Enemy forces were approaching, and he had seconds to decide. Abandon the position and leave wounded soldiers of both sides to die, defend it, and potentially use wounded men as human shields, or attempt an evacuation that would likely get his entire squad killed. Schneider chose a fourth option that military manuals never covered. He ordered his men to carry out as many wounded as possible, regardless of nationality, while he remained behind to provide covering fire. This wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. It was a split-second calculation that preserving life was more important than tactical advantage. He was killed defending the evacuation, but his decision saved 17 men who would have otherwise died. The psychological research on combat decision-making reveals something fascinating about human nature under extreme stress. When there's no time for conscious deliberation, soldiers fall back on their deepest moral programming, the values that were instilled in them long before they put on a uniform. The German soldiers who committed atrocities weren't acting on split-second impulses. They were following carefully planned orders. The soldiers who showed mercy and humanity were often acting on instinct. Private Walter Kruger faced a different kind of moral complexity when he encountered a Soviet soldier who had clearly been separated from his unit and was trying to surrender. But Kruger's squad had no way to transport prisoners, no ability to guard them, and no communication with command about what to do with captured enemies. Military protocol suggested one course of action, but Kruger's conscience suggested another. He made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He gave the Soviet soldier his own emergency rations, pointed him toward Soviet lines, and let him go. Technically, this was a court-martial offense. Practically, it may have saved both their lives. But Kruger never knew if that Soviet soldier made it back to safety, or if he was shot as a deserter by his own forces, or if he later killed other German soldiers in subsequent battles. These weren't abstract moral dilemmas. They were real decisions made by real men in impossible circumstances. And the weight of these decisions didn't disappear when the shooting stopped. They became part of the psychological burden that every combat veteran carried for the rest of their lives. Among all the German soldiers who faced the horror of World War II combat, perhaps none carried a heavier psychological burden than the medical personnel. They were required to maintain their humanity in situations designed to destroy it, to preserve life in an environment dedicated to ending it, and to make impossible choices about who lived and who died based on medical triage rather than military importance. Sanitator Hans Dietrich served with the 6th Army throughout the Eastern Front campaign, and his account of battlefield medicine reveals the moral complexity that civilians rarely consider. When multiple wounded soldiers needed immediate attention, and there were only enough medical supplies to save some of them, how do you choose? Military protocol said to prioritize soldiers who could return to combat over those who couldn't. Medical ethics said to treat the most severely wounded first. Human instinct said to help the man crying for his mother. Dietrich developed his own system, one that had nothing to do with military ranks or medical protocols. He treated wounded soldiers in the order he encountered them, regardless of nationality, rank, or severity of injuries. This wasn't officially sanctioned, but his commanding officers looked the other way, because Dietrich's survival rate was higher than medics who followed standard procedures. His secret was simple. He treated every wounded man as if he were his own brother. The psychological toll of battlefield medicine went beyond the obvious trauma of working with severe injuries under combat conditions. These men had to maintain steady hands while artillery exploded around them, had to make complex medical decisions while under sniper fire, had to watch men die despite their best efforts to save them. But perhaps most difficult of all, they had to remain compassionate when everything around them seemed designed to destroy compassion. Obergefreiter Max Weber, a medical orderly with the Afrika Korps, described the strange moral universe that combat medics inhabited. They were technically non-combatants, protected under international law, but they routinely risked their lives to retrieve wounded soldiers from active battlefields. They carried weapons for self-defense, but were trained never to use them unless directly attacked. They wore the same uniform as combat soldiers, but were expected to maintain medical neutrality even when treating enemy wounded. This created a psychological tension that many medics found harder to bear than the physical dangers of combat. They were simultaneously part of the military machine and separate from it, warriors who weren't supposed to fight, soldiers whose primary weapon was healing rather than killing. Many reported feeling like they existed in a moral limbo, neither fully military nor fully civilian, responsible for preserving life in an enterprise dedicated to ending it. The most haunting aspect of the combat medics' experience was the knowledge that their success was ultimately measured by how quickly they could return soldiers to combat. Every life they saved was a life that would be placed in mortal danger again within days or weeks. They weren't really saving these men, they were temporarily postponing their deaths. This realization created a form of psychological torture that many medics found unbearable. Yet despite these impossible contradictions, the medical personnel often provided the most powerful examples of human dignity and compassion in an environment that seemed designed to destroy both. Their accounts remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can choose to affirm life rather than death, healing rather than destruction, hope rather than despair. The hour of lead, that moment when ordinary men faced extraordinary circumstances, revealed something profound about human nature that goes far beyond military history. It showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear. That morality doesn't disappear under pressure, but instead reveals itself in its purest form. That humanity doesn't vanish in combat, but instead becomes more precious because it's more fragile. The German soldiers who lived through these experiences weren't heroes or villains in the simple sense that war stories often portray. They were human beings, faced with impossible choices, making split-second decisions that would echo through the rest of their lives. Some made choices they were proud of, others made choices they spent decades trying to forget. But all of them were forever changed by the hour of lead when battle became reality. Their stories remind us that war is not an abstract political or military concept, but an intensely personal human experience that tests every assumption we hold about ourselves and others. In the next chapter, we'll follow these same men as they tried to process what they had experienced, as the adrenaline faded and the real psychological reckoning began. Because surviving combat was only the first challenge. Learning to live with what they had done and seen would prove to be an even greater test of their humanity. Chapter 5. The Weight of Evening. The most dangerous time for a soldier isn't when the bullets are flying, it's when they stop. Because that's when your brain finally has permission to process what just happened. And what just happened can destroy you faster than any enemy weapon ever could. Hans Müller sits in the mud, staring at his hands. They're covered in blood, but he can't remember whose blood it is. Could be his, could be his friend's, could be someone he killed. In 30 minutes of combat, the lines between victim and perpetrator have blurred beyond recognition. This is the moment every military manual ignores. This is the hour they don't prepare you for in training. This is when being human becomes a liability that could get you killed. Welcome to the Weight of Evening in World War II. When German soldiers discovered that surviving the battle was only half the fight. Here's what nobody tells you about war. It has paperwork, lots of paperwork. Feldwebel Klaus Richter is holding a form that asks him to reduce 18-year-old Tommy Schneider to a series of checkboxes. Cause of death, artillery shell. Personal effects, 1 letter from mother, 1 photograph of girlfriend, 1 pack of cigarettes. Total value, worthless to everyone except the parents who will never see their son again. We started the day with 12 men, Richter later recalled. By evening roll call, I'm looking at 8 empty bedrolls and wondering how I'm supposed to explain to Berlin that 4 human beings just disappeared, like they never existed. But here's the psychological trap that destroys officers. The military doesn't want explanations, it wants efficiency. It wants those empty spaces filled with new recruits as quickly as possible. It wants Klaus to stop thinking of Tommy as a person and start thinking of him as a tactical resource that needs replacing. The mathematics of death become brutally simple. Subtract the casualties, divide the remaining supplies, multiply the fear by the growing certainty that tomorrow's equation will be worse. And somewhere in that mathematical reduction of human life, officers like Klaus start losing pieces of themselves. Because when you process enough death forms, you start seeing patterns. The same handwriting on casualty reports, the same age ranges in the morgue, the same last words repeated by dying boys who all seem to call for their mothers in the end. Wolfgang Becker wrote in his diary, "Today I learned that death has a soundtrack. It's not screaming or explosions, it's silence. The silence where a laugh used to be, the silence where someone's voice used to fill the space between orders, the silence that gets louder every day until it's the only thing you can hear." And here's what makes the accounting even more devastating. These forms go to families who still believe their sons are coming home for Christmas. Klaus Richter signs documents that will arrive at kitchen tables where mothers are saving extra food and fathers are planning conversations they'll never have. The bureaucracy of death doesn't pause for grief. While Klaus is writing Tommy's casualty report, he can hear Tommy's best friend sobbing in the next tent. But the form has a deadline. Berlin needs numbers. Statistics don't wait for emotions to catch up. This is how war breaks officers, not through combat, but through the administrative aftermath of combat, through the daily requirement to transform human tragedy into manageable data points, through the crushing realization that the military machine views their dead friends as acceptable losses in someone else's strategic calculations. They called it being tired, but Feldwebel Franz Dietrich knew it wasn't the kind of tired you fix with sleep. It was the kind of tired that lives in your bones, in your dreams, in the space between heartbeats where fear makes its home. "My hands shake when I light cigarettes," Franz confided to his diary. "Not because I'm afraid of dying, because I'm afraid of living with what I've done." This is 1943. There's no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no therapy, no counselling, no medical understanding of what happens to the human mind when it witnesses too much death. There's only one treatment for psychological trauma. Don't have it. Dr. Hermann Stout, a Wehrmacht medical officer, was forbidden from diagnosing mental breakdown. His orders were clear: patch up the bodies, send the minds back to fight. If a soldier couldn't sleep because of nightmares, prescribe stronger coffee. If he jumped at every sound, call it alertness. If he cried when he thought nobody was watching, call it weakness and threaten court-martial. But Dr. Stout kept secret notes, notes that wouldn't be declassified until 50 years after the war ended. And those notes reveal a medical catastrophe that German High Command refused to acknowledge. Their army was psychologically disintegrating from the inside out. Soldier presents with trembling hands, inability to focus, severe insomnia and violent reactions to loud sounds, Dr. Stout wrote about one patient. Recommended treatment, return to active duty, actual diagnosis. This man's mind is shattered beyond repair, but I'm not allowed to say that. The symptoms had no official names, but they had faces. Ernst Bauer couldn't eat without checking the corners of the room for snipers who weren't there. Ludwig Hoffmann would flinch whenever metal touched metal, because it sounded too much like bullets hitting steel. Heinrich Weber started conversations with dead friends and didn't realize they were dead until someone reminded him. And here's the cruelest part. These men knew they were breaking down, but admitting it meant execution for desertion. So they developed elaborate coping mechanisms to hide their trauma from officers who might be experiencing the exact same symptoms. They wrote letters they never sent, pouring their terror onto paper and then burning it before anyone could read it. They carved intricate figurines from spent ammunition, their hands staying busy while their minds tried to process the unprocessable. They told jokes that weren't funny about death, that wasn't abstract. Most of all, they learned to perform sanity, to act normal when normal had stopped existing months ago, to pretend they weren't haunted by faces that appeared in their peripheral vision, to function as soldiers when their humanity was screaming for them to run home and never look back. Franz Dietrich described it perfectly. We became actors playing the role of ourselves from before the war. But the longer you act like someone you used to be, the harder it becomes to remember who you actually are. Obergefreiter Ernst Bauer kept a secret for 36 years. In December 1943, during a winter offensive that left more German soldiers dead than the entire population of his hometown, Ernst found a wounded Soviet soldier in a shell crater. The man was barely conscious, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, mumbling a name that sounded like Maria. Military protocol was crystal clear. Enemy wounded were to be taken prisoner if practical, eliminated if not practical. But Ernst had just spent 6 hours watching friends die, and he couldn't bring himself to kill one more person, even if that person was supposed to be his enemy. So he did something that could have gotten him executed. He used his own medical supplies to stop the bleeding. He shared his water ration. He left the Soviet soldier hidden in the crater with enough bandages to possibly survive until his own forces found him. "Why did you do it?" his grandson asked him in 1979, when Ernst finally told someone about his secret. Ernst thought for a long time before answering, "Because he was calling for Maria. My wife's name is Maria. In that moment he wasn't my enemy, he was just another man calling for someone he loved." These moments of humanity weren't rare exceptions that prove how good some soldiers were. They were daily occurrences that prove how human all soldiers remained, even when everything around them was designed to strip away their humanity. Sanitator Ludwig Hoffmann treated wounded soldiers regardless of which uniform they wore. His field journal contains entries that would have been considered treasonous if discovered. "Treated British prisoner today, bullet wound infected. While cleaning the wound, he showed me a photograph of his son. Boy looks maybe 5 years old, same age as my nephew. I gave him extra morphine, can't explain why. War makes us forget we're all somebody's son." The sharing of food became a universal language that transcended nationality. German soldiers would leave coffee for British soldiers, who would leave chocolate in return. American soldiers shared cigarettes with German prisoners, who repaid the kindness by sharing news from home when letters were allowed through military censors. But perhaps the most profound acts of humanity involved burying the dead. Enemy soldiers could have left bodies to rot as psychological warfare. Instead, they often dug graves, carved crude crosses, collected personal effects to send home if possible. These weren't official military actions ordered by headquarters. These were individual choices made by soldiers who understood that every body had been someone's son, someone's husband, someone's future. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber participated in an informal burial truce in early 1944. German and American soldiers worked side by side for 2 hours, digging graves and saying prayers over men who had been trying to kill each other the day before. "We didn't talk much," Weber remembered. "What was there to say? But I'll never forget the American sergeant who helped me carry a German corporal to his grave. We were enemies, but in that moment we were just two men who understood that death deserves dignity, regardless of which flag you died under." These stories weren't included in military reports. They weren't mentioned in letters home because military censors would have removed them. They survived only in private diaries and in conversations whispered decades later, when old men finally felt safe enough to admit they had chosen compassion over military efficiency. 3:30 in the morning is when Hauptmann Friedrich Weber always woke up. Not 3:15, not 3:45. Exactly 3:30 every night for 15 years after the war ended. Always the same cold sweat, always the same faces staring back at him from the darkness of his bedroom ceiling, always the same question echoing in his mind: why did I survive when they didn't? The long night wasn't just about sleep. It was about the hours when soldiers couldn't stay busy enough to avoid thinking. When all the tasks were finished and the watch was set, and there was nothing left to do but exist with their thoughts. For many German soldiers, these were the most dangerous hours of any day, because that's when the war became real. During daylight you could focus on orders, on tactical problems, on the immediate requirements of staying alive. But darkness stripped away all the distractions and left you alone with the accumulated weight of everything you'd seen, everything you'd done, everything you'd failed to prevent. Gefreiter Heinz Kramer wrote to his sister in 1944, "The days are manageable because I have duties to perform, problems to solve, orders to follow, but the nights are killing me. When everything goes quiet, I can hear every conversation I ever had with every friend I've lost. I can see every face I'll never see again. The nights make this war feel permanent, like this is all there is and all there will ever be." The darkness brought questions that had no answers, and doubts that couldn't be shared with anyone. Soldiers would lie in their bunkers, staring at canvas ceilings, wondering if their families back home would recognize the men they were becoming. Wondering if the war would end before it finished transforming them into something they didn't want to be. The letters home became exercises in creative fiction. Military censors would remove anything that might damage morale on the home front, so soldiers couldn't write about the fear, the trauma, the growing certainty that Germany was losing this war. Instead, they wrote about missing home-cooked meals, about looking forward to Christmas, about weather and rations and everything except the truth. But the truth found its way into private diaries, into conversations between trusted friends, into prayers whispered in languages their mothers taught them before they learned to march in formation. The truth was that many German soldiers had stopped believing in victory. They had stopped believing in the cause. Many had stopped believing they would ever see home again. Obergefreiter Karl Brandt, captured by American forces in 1945, described the psychological weight of those long nights. You start doing math you don't want to do. How many friends have died? How many are left? What are the odds you'll see another spring? The nights force you to face statistics that make it clear this can only end one way, and that way doesn't include most of us going home. Some soldiers found ways to make the nights bearable. They would write detailed letters to sweethearts, describing impossible future plans that both of them knew would never happen. They would sketch pictures of home from memory, adding details that might not have been real but felt true. They would tell stories, not war stories, but stories from before the war, when life was simple and death was still abstract. The most heartbreaking nights were when packages arrived from home, a photograph showing how much a baby sister had grown while you were gone, a piece of cake that your mother somehow managed to bake despite rationing, a letter from a girlfriend trying to pretend everything was normal while her entire world fell apart around her. These connections to home became both salvation and torture. They reminded soldiers what they were fighting to return to, but they also made the contrast between home and war so stark that it became almost unbearable. How do you write back to someone describing their normal Tuesday when your normal Tuesday involves death and destruction on an industrial scale? The messenger arrives at 4 in the morning, just as the first hint of dawn touches the eastern horizon. Hauptmann Weber recognizes him immediately, one of the dispatch riders from division headquarters, his uniform mud-splattered from riding through shell-torn roads in the darkness. The man's face carries the grim expression of someone delivering news that no one wants to hear. The envelope is marked with the highest classification, immediate action required, commanding officer only. Weber's hands don't shake as he breaks the wax seal. They stopped shaking months ago, when he moved beyond fear into something much worse, acceptance of the inevitable. As his eyes scan the typed orders, his expression changes in ways that 3 years of warfare haven't managed to achieve. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that might be horror or might be relief. It's impossible to tell which, and maybe that's the point. The paper crumples slightly in his grip as he reads the message twice, then 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that makes sense, as if headquarters might have made a mistake that could still be corrected. But there's no mistake. The orders are clear, specific, and absolutely final. Weber looks at his sleeping men, boys really, most of them younger than his own son back in Munich. Boys who trust him to lead them through another day, another week, another month of war. Boys who still believe that following orders means something, that their sacrifice matters, that there's still a possibility this will end with something resembling victory. He folds the message carefully and places it in his breast pocket right next to the photograph of his wife and son. The same pocket where he keeps the letter he writes every week but never sends. The letter that tells them what this war has really done to him, what he's become, what choices he's made in the name of duty and survival. In 4 hours, when the men wake up, he'll have to gather them together and explain what Berlin has decided about their future. In 4 hours, he'll have to find words to describe orders that seem designed by people who have never heard gunfire, never counted bodies, never looked into the eyes of 18-year-old soldiers and convinced them that dying for the fatherland still means something. But right now, in these final moments before dawn breaks and war demands another day of impossible decisions, Weber allows himself one last look at that photograph. One last moment of being a husband and father instead of an officer in a disintegrating army, because the message in his pocket changes everything they thought they knew about this war, and after today, nothing will ever be the same again. What could headquarters possibly order that would shake a battle-hardened commander who has survived 3 years of the worst fighting in human history? What news could arrive that would make a man who has seen everything suddenly fear what comes next? The answer lies folded in Friedrich Weber's breast pocket, and it will redefine everything these soldiers thought they understood about duty, survival, and the true cost of following orders when your government has already decided the war is lost. Chapter 6. The Last Light. The message in Hauptmann Weber's pocket contained 3 words that would end the world as he knew it. Unconditional surrender imminent. Not defeat, not retreat, not strategic withdrawal. Surrender. The complete and total collapse of everything he had been trained to defend, everything his men had died for, everything that had given meaning to 3 years of hell. But here's the strangest thing about the end of the world. It doesn't end with explosions or dramatic music. It ends with paperwork. It ends with confused orders. It ends with soldiers standing in fields looking at each other, wondering what they're supposed to do now that there's nothing left to fight for. May 8th, 1945. The day Germany died and Germans had to figure out how to live. The war didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper. a radio broadcast, a piece of paper signed in a schoolhouse, and suddenly millions of men who had spent years learning how to kill had to remember how to be human again. Some of them couldn't remember how. Feldwebel Klaus Richter was cleaning his rifle when the news came. 3 years of muscle memory, 3 years of ritual, 3 years of keeping his weapon ready for the next battle. He had dismantled and reassembled this rifle thousands of times. He could do it blindfolded in the dark, under artillery fire. But on May 8, 1945, his hands stopped working. The words came over the radio in a voice that sounded like it was reading a grocery list. All German forces will cease active operations at 23:01 hours, the 8th of May, 1945. That was it. No grand speeches, no final rallying cry, no explanation of what any of it had meant, just a timestamp and the end of everything. Richter looked down at the pieces of his rifle scattered on the table. For 3 years this weapon had been the difference between life and death. It had been his protector, his responsibility, his most trusted companion. And now it was just metal and wood, just another piece of equipment that belonged to an army that no longer existed. But the psychological impact went deeper than confusion. These men had organized their entire adult lives around military structure. They woke up when ordered, ate when ordered, moved when ordered, fought when ordered. They had surrendered individual decision-making in exchange for the clarity of following commands. And suddenly there were no more commands. Obergefreiter Hans Müller described the moment years later. "You know what's strange about the end of a war? You think you'll feel relief, you think you'll feel joy, you think you'll feel something, but mostly you feel empty, like someone reached inside you and removed the thing that made you who you were. I had been a soldier for so long I couldn't remember how to be anything else." The practical questions came immediately. Where do you go when you don't have orders telling you where to go? What do you eat when there's no more army food distribution? Who are you when you're not part of a unit, a regiment, a cause? These weren't philosophical questions. They were survival questions that needed immediate answers. Some units simply dissolved. Men walked away from their posts, dropped their weapons, and started walking toward home. Others stayed together, unsure whether leaving would be considered desertion, even though there was no longer an army to desert from. The most heartbreaking were the young soldiers who had never known adult life outside the military, 18-year-olds who had been drafted straight from school and now found themselves in a world where their only skills were combat skills no one wanted anymore. The officers faced an even crueler dilemma. They had spent years making life and death decisions for their men. They had led them through battles, kept them alive, given their lives meaning and purpose. And now they had to tell these men to go home to a country that might not want them back, to families who might not recognize who they had become, to a future that felt more uncertain than any battlefield they had ever faced. The irony was devastating. After years of dreaming about the war ending, many German soldiers discovered that the end of war felt more terrifying than war itself. At least in war, they knew who they were and what they were supposed to do. Peace offered no such clarity. The train that carried Gefreiter Wolfgang Becker home to Munich in June 1945 took 14 hours to travel a distance that used to take 4. Not because of battle damage, though there was plenty of that, but because the train stopped at every station while former soldiers tried to figure out if they were allowed to continue, if they had the right papers, if home still existed. Becker had been gone for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. He had counted every one. He had dreamed about walking through his front door, embracing his wife, meeting the daughter who had been born while he was fighting in Russia. He had written the scene in his mind 1,000 times during the long nights when staying awake was the only way to stay alive. But the man who stepped off that train wasn't the same man who had kissed his wife goodbye in 1942. And the woman waiting for him wasn't the same woman he had married. And the little girl hiding behind her mother's skirt was a stranger who had learned to fear loud noises and sudden movements because bombs had been falling on Munich for months. The reunion he had imagined never happened. Instead, they stood in the kitchen of their small apartment. 3 people who shared a name and a history but had become foreigners to each other. His wife had learned to make decisions alone, to raise a child alone, to survive air raids alone. She had become someone stronger and more independent than the woman he remembered. And she was looking at a man who jumped at the sound of the neighbour's door slamming, who couldn't sleep in a bed because it felt too soft, who called their daughter by the wrong name because he had been writing letters to an infant and couldn't adjust to the fact that she was now a talking 3-year-old. The practical challenges were overwhelming. Becker's old job at the factory no longer existed. The factory had been bombed and the company had closed. His wife had been working at a munitions plant, but that job disappeared the day the war ended. Their savings were worthless because the German economy had collapsed. The apartment building had suffered bomb damage, and repairs were impossible because there were no materials and no workers. But the emotional challenges were worse. Becker's wife would later tell their daughter, "Your father came home, but the man I married was still at war somewhere. He would wake up screaming. He couldn't tolerate crowds. He couldn't stand the sound of aircraft, even passenger planes. He would hoard food like we were still being rationed, and he couldn't talk about any of it. The war had taught him how to follow orders and kill enemies, but nobody had taught him how to be a husband and father again." The children were perhaps the most difficult adjustment. Becker's daughter had spent her entire conscious life hearing that her father was a hero fighting for the fatherland. But the man who came home didn't look like a hero. He looked tired and scared and angry. He couldn't explain why the war had happened or what it had accomplished or why so many people had died. He couldn't even explain why he had survived when so many of his friends hadn't. Across Germany, similar scenes played out in millions of homes. Fathers who no longer knew how to play with their children. Wives who had become widows in everything but name. Sons who had left as boys and returned as broken men. The physical reconstruction of Germany would take decades, but the emotional reconstruction of German families would take even longer. Many marriages didn't survive. The divorce rate among returning German soldiers was catastrophic, though exact numbers were rarely recorded because admitting marital failure was seen as another form of defeat. Some men simply left again, unable to bridge the gap between who they had been and who they needed to become. Others stayed physically, but never really came home emotionally. The most tragic cases were the soldiers who discovered that home no longer existed at all. Their families had been killed in bombing raids, their houses destroyed, their entire neighbourhoods reduced to rubble. These men had survived years of combat only to discover that the world they had been fighting to protect had been erased while they were gone. The questions came slowly at first, then all at once. Questions that German soldiers had been too busy surviving to ask, too frightened to consider, too exhausted to process. But in the quiet months after the war ended, when the immediate struggle for survival gave way to the longer struggle for understanding, the questions became impossible to avoid. What had they really been fighting for? What had they accomplished? What had they been part of? And perhaps most difficult of all, what were they responsible for? Hauptmann Friedrich Weber spent 6 months in an Allied prisoner of war camp before being released in late 1945. During those months, he was forced to watch films that documented concentration camps, mass graves, systematic murder. Films that showed what had been happening while he was leading his men through battles in Russia and France and Italy. "They made us watch," he said in a 1967 interview, one of the few times he ever spoke publicly about the war. "They said we needed to see what we had been fighting for. But I swear to you, I had never seen those places. I had never heard those orders. I had been fighting Russians and Americans and British soldiers, soldiers like me who were shooting back. I had never even seen a concentration camp." But the interrogators weren't interested in what Weber had seen. They were interested in what he had chosen not to see, what he had chosen not to ask about, what he had chosen not to question. They wanted to know how millions of German soldiers could fight for years without knowing about the systematic murder happening in their own country. The honest answer was more complicated than either the interrogators or the prisoners wanted to admit. Most German soldiers had heard rumours, fragments of stories, whispered conversations that hinted at something terrible happening behind the lines. But they had been trained not to ask questions, not to doubt their superiors, not to think beyond their immediate orders. And when you're fighting for your life every day, when you're watching your friends die, when you're barely surviving yourself, it becomes very easy to focus only on what's directly in front of you. Obergefreiter Ernst Bauer struggled with these questions for the rest of his life. Did I know? Did I choose not to know? Could I have done something different? I was 19 years old. I was scared. I was just trying to stay alive and keep my friends alive. But does that excuse not asking harder questions? Does that excuse following orders without thinking about what those orders were part of? The psychological defence mechanisms that had kept German soldiers functional during the war became barriers to understanding after the war. The ability to compartmentalise, to focus only on immediate tasks, to avoid thinking about larger implications, these survival skills made it nearly impossible to process the full scope of what they had been part of. Some soldiers attempted to draw distinctions between their service and the atrocities committed by other parts of the Nazi apparatus. They had been regular army, not SS. They had fought enemy soldiers, not civilians. They had followed military orders, not ideological commands. These distinctions mattered to them, but they didn't satisfy the world that was judging them. Others accepted collective responsibility, even for crimes they had not personally committed. They argued that wearing the uniform made them complicit, that fighting for the Nazi state made them part of everything that state did, regardless of their personal knowledge or intentions. The most honest struggled with both perspectives simultaneously. They acknowledged that they had been part of something monstrous, while also insisting that their individual actions had been guided by survival, loyalty to their fellow soldiers, and the military values they had been taught since childhood. They lived with the terrible complexity of being both victims and perpetrators, patriots and war criminals, depending on which lens was used to examine their service. These conversations didn't happen in public. They happened in private, between friends who had shared the experience in therapy sessions decades later, in letters that were never sent. German society wasn't ready to discuss the moral complexity of individual soldiers' experiences, and the soldiers themselves often lacked the language to express their confusion and guilt. 50 years after the war ended, Hans Müller sat in his garden in Bavaria, surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as the man who grew the best tomatoes in the village and always had candy in his pockets. They had no idea that their grandfather's hands, now gentle with seedlings and skilled at tying shoes, had once held a rifle and fired at other young men who were probably also thinking about home. Müller had made a decision in 1945 that millions of other German veterans made. He would not talk about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. The war would be a closed chapter, a period of his life that ended on May 8th and would never be reopened. But memory doesn't follow the orders we give it. Memory has its own agenda, its own timeline, its own way of demanding attention. And as Müller grew older, as his grandchildren asked innocent questions about history, as documentaries appeared on television and books filled the shelves, the closed chapter kept trying to open itself. "Opa, were you in the war?" his 8-year-old granddaughter asked one afternoon while they were planting carrots. Such a simple question. Such an impossible question to answer. How do you explain to a child that you fought for the wrong side in the most important conflict in human history? How do you explain that you were brave and cowardly, honourable and complicit, victim and perpetrator, sometimes all in the same day? How do you explain that you loved your country and hated what it became, that you fought for your friends rather than your flag, that you survived when better men died and you've never understood why? Müller looked at his granddaughter's face, curious, innocent, trusting, and realized that his silence had become its own form of lie. By refusing to discuss the war, he had allowed her to grow up thinking that history was simple, that good and evil were clearly defined, that people always knew which side they were on and why. "Yes, Liebling," he finally said. "I was in the war." "Were you a hero, Opa?" And there it was, the question that had haunted him for 50 years. The question that had no good answer because it demanded a level of moral certainty that the war had made impossible. "I tried to be," he said after a long pause. "But war makes it very hard to be a hero. Sometimes the best you can do is try to be human." That conversation, repeated in different forms across Germany, represents one of the most difficult aspects of post-war memory. How do you integrate a morally complicated past into a morally simplified present? How do you honour the humanity of individual soldiers while acknowledging the inhumanity of the cause they served? Different families found different answers. Some maintained complete silence, taking their war experiences to the grave. Others created sanitized versions that emphasized suffering without mentioning complicity. A few attempted honest reckoning, sharing the full complexity of their experiences with children and grandchildren who often weren't prepared to handle such moral ambiguity. The most profound challenge was that the veterans themselves often didn't know what to think about their own experiences. They had lived through events that exceeded their ability to process them. They had made decisions under circumstances that no longer existed. They had been shaped by a historical moment that their post-war selves could barely comprehend. Dr. Klaus Naumann, who interviewed hundreds of German veterans in the 1980s and 1990s, observed many of these men had spent 50 years trying to understand their own lives. They knew what they had done, but they struggled to understand what it meant. They remembered their experiences vividly, but they couldn't always explain how those experiences fit into the larger historical narrative. They were eyewitnesses to history, but they weren't necessarily historians. The challenge of memory was complicated by the changing political landscape. What it meant to have been a German soldier evolved as Germany itself evolved. Veterans who had been seen as defeated enemies in 1945 were eventually seen as fellow victims of Nazi manipulation. Later, they were seen as part of a generation that needed to be held accountable. Then they were seen as elderly men whose stories needed to be preserved before they were lost forever. Each shift in perspective required veterans to reconsider their own experiences, to find new language for old memories, to integrate new understanding into old trauma. The result was that many German veterans lived their entire post-war lives feeling like strangers to their own past, unable to fully embrace or fully reject the men they had been during the war. The last living veteran of our story died in 2019. His name was Heinrich Fischer, and he was 97 years old when his heart finally stopped carrying the weight of memories that had sustained and tormented him for nearly 8 decades. In his final interview, conducted just months before his death, Fischer was asked what he wanted people to understand about German soldiers in World War II. His answer, delivered in a voice that was still strong despite his age, summarized the complexity that had defined his entire generation. We were not monsters, but we served monsters. We were not heroes, but we sometimes did heroic things. We were not victims, but we were victimized. We were not innocent, but most of us were ignorant. We were young men who found ourselves in the middle of history's greatest catastrophe, and we did what we thought we had to do to survive and protect each other. Some of those decisions were right, some were wrong. Many were just decisions that had to be made too quickly by people too young to understand their full implications. He paused, looking out the window of his room in the nursing home, toward the garden where he had spent his final years growing flowers instead of taking lives. I have spent 74 years trying to understand what happened to me, what I was part of, what it all meant. I still don't have complete answers, but I know this: war doesn't make you a better person or a worse person. It reveals who you already are, and then it changes you in ways you never recover from. The boy who went to war in 1941 died somewhere in Russia in 1943. The man who came home in 1945 was someone else entirely, and the old man talking to you now is still trying to figure out how all these different people can be the same person. This, perhaps, is the ultimate truth about the German soldiers of World War II. They were human beings who found themselves in an inhuman situation, asked to make impossible choices with inadequate information and insufficient time. They were neither the heroic warriors of Nazi propaganda nor the mindless automatons of Allied caricature. They were complicated people living through the most complicated period in human history. Their stories matter not because they were German or because they were soldiers, but because they were human. They faced the same fundamental questions that confront anyone caught in moral crisis. How do you maintain your humanity when the world around you has lost its humanity? How do you do what's right when you're not sure what right means anymore? How do you take care of the people you love when love itself becomes a luxury you can't afford? These questions didn't end with the war. They echo through every conflict, every crisis, every moment, when ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. The German soldiers of World War II were not unique in facing these dilemmas. They were simply among the most documented, the most studied, the most scrutinized examples of what happens when history demands more from people than they thought they could give. Their legacy is not in the battles they won or lost, not in the ideology they served or rejected, but in the questions they leave behind. Questions about duty and conscience, about survival and sacrifice, about the price of following orders and the cost of thinking for yourself. Questions that every generation must answer for itself, in its own time, under its own circumstances. The last light of their generation has faded, but the shadows they cast still fall across our understanding of war, memory, and what it means to be human in the face of inhuman demands. Their stories remind us that history is not made by abstract forces or inevitable trends, but by individual people making individual choices, one decision at a time, often without knowing how those decisions will be judged by future generations. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson from their experience. We are all capable of both great courage and great cowardice, great compassion and great cruelty, depending on the circumstances we face and the choices we make. The German soldiers of World War II were not different from us. They were us, placed in circumstances we hope never to face, making choices we hope never to have to make. Their story is our story, separated only by time and chance. And that, more than any political lesson or military insight, is why their voices still matter, why their memories still haunt us, and why we must continue to listen to them long after the last of them has gone silent. The sun sets differently when you know you've seen your last war. Heinrich Fischer discovered this in 1945, watching the light fade over a bombed-out German town whose name he never learned. The same light that had illuminated 3 years of violence and death suddenly looked different, softer, more forgiving, full of possibility instead of threat. 74 years later, Fischer would describe that moment as the beginning of his real life. Everything before had been preparation. Everything during had been survival. Everything after had been the long, difficult process of learning how to live with what he had seen, what he had done, and what he had failed to do. He never completely succeeded at that learning. None of them did. But they tried. And in their trying, in their questions, in their decades of wrestling with memory and meaning, they left us something more valuable than answers. They left us the understanding that being human is not about being perfect. It's about being conscious of our imperfections, responsible for our choices, and committed to learning from our mistakes. It's about recognizing that we are all capable of both light and darkness, depending on the circumstances that test us. The German soldiers of World War II were not heroes or villains. They were human beings, and that, ultimately, is both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing anyone can be. Their last light has faded, but the questions they lived with, the struggles they endured, and the humanity they tried to preserve in the midst of inhumanity, these continue to illuminate the choices we face today. We are not them, but we are not unlike them. And in that recognition lies both our greatest fear and our greatest hope. Conclusion. As the last veteran closes his eyes for the final time, we're left with a question that will outlive us all. What do we do with the truth when the truth is too terrible to bear? Klaus Brenner died on a Tuesday morning in 2007. His grandson held his hand as he whispered his final confession, the secret that had shaped 62 years of silence. In that moment, the weight of history passed from one generation to the next, along with an impossible choice: preserve the comfortable lie or face the devastating truth. Tonight you've witnessed something extraordinary. You've heard the voices that history tried to silence. You've seen through the eyes of men who were taught to believe they were heroes, but died knowing they were something else entirely. You've discovered that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you, it's the one living inside your own conscience. These stories matter not because they excuse anything, but because they explain everything. They explain how decent people become complicit in indecent systems. They explain how good intentions can pave the road to hell. They explain how the word evil becomes meaningless when applied to millions of ordinary human beings who simply chose comfort over courage, silence over truth, loyalty over conscience. But perhaps most importantly, these stories explain why we must never stop asking uncomfortable questions, why we must never stop challenging comfortable narratives, why we must never stop remembering that the capacity for both good and evil lives within every human heart. The German soldiers of World War II are dying, their voices are fading, their secrets are dying with them. But their warning echoes across time with urgent clarity. Watch for the signs, question the orders, resist the comfortable lies, and never ever assume that you would have acted differently, because the terrible truth is that most of us wouldn't have. We would have followed orders. We would have remained silent. We would have chosen survival over conscience. We would have become exactly what they became. Human beings who discovered too late that they had traded their souls for the illusion of safety. The farm boy who wrote that final letter in 1945 spent the rest of his life trying to answer one question. How do you live with yourself when you've done the unthinkable? His answer, whispered in his final breath, was simple and devastating. You don't. You just exist. Klaus Brenner's grandson made a different choice. He broke the silence. He told the truth. He chose to honor his grandfather not by preserving the comfortable lie, but by facing the uncomfortable truth. And in doing so, he discovered something that his grandfather never could, that the only way to redeem the past is to learn from it. These voices from the past carry a message for the future. As democracy trembles across the globe, as authoritarianism rises from the ashes of history, as ordinary people once again face the choice between comfort and conscience, these ghostly voices whisper their warning. This is how it begins. This is how it always begins. With the simple act of looking away. With the comfortable lie that someone else will take responsibility. With the seductive belief that following orders absolves you of moral choice. With the fatal assumption that evil announces itself with clear signs and obvious warnings. It doesn't. Evil comes disguised as duty, as loyalty, as the simple act of keeping your head down and following orders, as the understandable desire to protect your family, your career, your comfortable life. The last light of this generation is fading, but their stories remain, not as excuses but as warnings, not as justifications but as explanations, not as heroes or villains but as mirror images of ourselves, human beings who discovered what they were capable of when everything they believed in collapsed around them. The question isn't whether you would have been different. The question is whether you will be different. The question is whether you will have the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. The question is whether you will choose truth over comfort, conscience over convenience, resistance over compliance. The question is whether you will learn from their failures or repeat them. History is watching. Your children are watching. Your conscience is watching. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghosts of Klaus Brenner and millions like him are watching too, waiting to see if their suffering, their shame, their final whispered confessions will serve any purpose at all. The choice is yours. The time is now. The warning has been given. What will you do with it? This has been a day in the life German soldiers of World War II. The story you needed to hear, the perspective you needed to see. The truth that will change everything you thought you knew about war, about humanity, and about yourself. Remember their names, remember their faces, remember their warnings, and remember that the price of silence is always paid by the innocent. Never again means never again, but it only means something if we remember how it happened the first time. The silence is broken, the truth is told, the warning is given. What happens next is up to you.